The 6 o'clock news from the BBC with Peter Sissons and Moira Stewart.
Good evening. The headlines at 6 o'clock. Jason Donovan is awarded £200,000 libel damages over a magazine article he says suggested he was gay and a hypocrite. The pop singer and actor says he's been totally vindicated and his name cleared. In the election, Neil Kinnock denies making overtures to the Liberal Democrats. But John Major accuses Labour of cuddling up to the Liberal Democrats for support. And Paddy Ashdown warns both parties not to go it alone with a minority government. Also, the row about safety at Aintree on the eve of the Grand National. A High Court jury awards the pop star and actor Jason Donovan £200,000 in libel damages. The jury decided that an article in The Face magazine had suggested he was a homosexual and a liar and a hypocrite for denying it. The singer said he felt totally vindicated by the result. It had cleared the slur that he'd lied about himself. The verdict and the award came only hours after the judge had urged the jury to be reasonable in deciding damages and not to go over the top. The magazine also faces £200,000 in costs and may have to close. The judge granted the magazine a stay on paying the award while it considers an appeal.
Jason Donovan arrived at the High Court amid chaotic scenes, surrounded by dozens of photographers and scores of fans. The libel action has been big box office. The 23-year-old actor, singer and star of the West End said he was determined to bring this case after 18 months of intolerable speculation and rumour concerning his private life. He sued after an article was published in The Face magazine last August suggesting he was homosexual. Printed on the page opposite was a picture of him with 3 words superimposed on it, one of which was the word queer. Mr. Donovan told the court he'd been disgusted by the story because he'd always insisted he was not gay. By suggesting otherwise, he said, the article was branding him a hypocrite and a liar. The publishers of The Face, Nicholas Logan and Wagadan Limited, denied libel, as did freelance writer Ben Summerskill. They claimed they were taking a serious look at outing the public naming of alleged homosexuals. The judge, Mr. Justice Drake, warned the jury not to go over the top if they did decide on damages, urging them to bear in mind how much people get if they suffer a physical injury which lasts a lifetime. The jury took a little under 3 hours to reach their decision, finding in favour of Mr. Donovan and awarding him £200,000 in damages. The verdict was greeted by screams of delight from more than 80 youngsters who'd packed inside the court. As he emerged, dozens more mobbed the singer, so too did the press. Mr. Donovan said he was delighted at the verdict.
This has not been a case about homosexuality, and I resent any suggestion that it was. Everybody should feel free to live their lives as they wish. I am heterosexual. The decision totally vindicates me and clears my name of the slur that I have lied about myself.
There was delight too from the fans.
It's brilliant.
It's brilliant. It's the best thing I've heard all day. He deserves all the money he gets because, like, it's just not right standing with someone's reputation like that. He just deserves all the money he gets.
The Face, though, said they were shocked, would appeal, and now faced bankruptcy.
The defendants believed that the article was a responsible discussion of the phenomena of outing. Nick Logan and Ben Summerskill now face the prospect of financial ruin.
The case also worried gay and lesbian groups who were at the High Court.
We're particularly concerned at the way in which it's been implied in court that to say someone is gay is a slur on their character. We do not believe that. We believe that lesbian and gay people are just as valid and just as worthwhile as heterosexuals.
While attention will again focus on whether juries should decide levels of damages, Jason Donovan was planning to celebrate by returning full-time to his career. He says he now wants to be left alone. This afternoon, there seemed little likelihood of that.
A short time ago, Jason Donovan's manager, Richard East, said Mr. Donovan's purpose in bringing the action was to clear his name and not to close The Face magazine. He said both sides had agreed to discuss the matter so as to allow it to continue to publish.
As the election campaign enters its final week, the issues of electoral reform and a hung parliament have once again been prominent. Paddy Ashdown restated his demand for a commitment to the introduction of proportional representation as the price of Liberal Democrat support, should there be no outright winner. The Prime Minister said Labour was now cuddling up to the Liberals for support, and that he said was like leaning on candy floss. Labour set out its legislative programme for a new parliament, but denied they were trying to offer a deal to the Liberal Democrats.
All senior politicians are well aware that in 7 days they could be grappling with the problems of a hung parliament. But for Labour's strategy team meeting early this morning, just like their Tory counterparts, the problem was how not to give the impression you expect a hung parliament. They didn't want reports of Labour's moves on proportional representation to look like weakness. And that's why Mr Kinnock insisted that promising a role for the Liberal Democrats in a committee looking at PR wasn't an offer of a deal.
Not an overture, not an intermezzo, not even the opening chords, because we established this process over 2 years ago. So the idea that this whole process has been conceived in order somehow to creakily open the door to the Liberals has got no substance at all. It has merit in itself.
But Labour are trying to attract possible Liberal Democrat voters, and they do have an eye on what could happen in a hung parliament. They gave a version of their first Queen's speech, clearly designed to have the widest possible appeal.
There would be a bill to abolish the poll tax completely, with no modifications, a bill to establish a Scottish Parliament, a bill to introduce a Freedom of Information Act.
If Labour have no overall majority but are the largest party, their plan is to put this Queen's speech to Parliament. That might put the other parties in a spot, because if they voted it down, they could be blamed for causing another election. In a BBC phone-in, the Education Secretary suggested, in those circumstances, the Tories would vote against.
If the Queen's speech is put forward which resembles remotely Neil Kinnock's current views, I will vote against it. So I assume with the rest of my party.
Throughout the campaign, Cabinet Ministers have tried not to talk about a hung parliament. It was a strategy they agreed with Mr Major at the start. But the Tories, too, have been worried by the increase in Liberal Democrat support. Once again, they warned of the dangers of either letting Labour in or reaching an inconclusive verdict.
80% of the businessmen who were questioned, rather over 80%, said that they thought a hung parliament would be bad for the prospects of recovery, bad for British business, bad for their own businesses. They seem to take the view, and I share it, that a hung parliament would hang Britain and hang recovery.
The Liberal Democrats were the only one of the main parties who appeared happy to be talking about a hung parliament. Mr Ashdown once again insisted that they would make no deal to break the deadlock unless there was a promise to legislate on PR. They would be prepared to vote against a Labour Queen's speech.
If there is not a partnership government, if the next government rejects the views of the electorate, which asks us to work together, if they choose instability rather than stability, if they put the interests of their party before the interests of the country, this is a government that will deserve to go.
What we're seeing are the opening shots in a battle Labour and the Conservatives are fervently hoping they won't have to fight. All the parties are mainly concerned in simply getting on with their campaigns. But if, as so many opinion polls have suggested, there is a hung parliament, none of the main players wants to be caught by surprise.
As the last full week of the campaign draws to a close, the leaders of the three main parties have again been taking their message around the country. Our first report is from Kent, where the Prime Minister has been campaigning.
Although John Major says he's been ploughing his own furrow on the campaign trail more this week, taking his message directly to the people, the soapbox was discarded first thing today for another series of staged photo opportunities. The first on Sheerness's recently privatised docks on the Kent coast, where he was in the kind of mood more associated with his immediate predecessor.
Right, so down we go. Busy day. Make way for the Prime Minister.
After the midweek shock of a 7-point Labour lead in one opinion poll, the Tories will be studying new ones this weekend as closely as Mr Major was watching his fingers with shire horses at a hop farm this lunchtime. The Conservatives continue to claim that, in fact, the two main parties are as neck and neck as a couple of barn owls on John Major's arm at yet another event for the cameras. Attack those journalists, ordered the Prime Minister jokingly. But it is true, say his aides, he feels some of the more complicated issues, principally on foreign and constitutional affairs, have not been coming across strongly enough in coverage dominated by the television soundbite.
Are we going to have PR? No! Too right we're not.
But there were plenty more of said sound bites when the soapbox finally came out this afternoon as the Prime Minister addressed the current election issue, the question of Labour's overtures to the Liberal Democrats on proportional representation, a voting system John Major insists always leads to weak government.
The pace in the final days of this campaign is hotting up, and Mr Kinnock took the fastest route to Southampton, the kind of territory Labour must win if this trail is to lead to Downing Street. 1,992 balloons had been laboriously netted so that Mr Kinnock could send them on their way to the continent, a manoeuvre designed to illustrate the party's commitment to Europe. Campaign managers say their confidence is riding high, but they're not complacent. Nevertheless, Mr Kinnock believes that this time next week he'll have plenty to do.
There'll be the government to appoint and a lot of other arrangements to get on with. And I think that everything's pointing very much in that direction. But we keep on working, we take nothing for granted, and we keep on extending our appeal.
But his attempt to broaden that appeal in the city centre didn't meet with everyone's approval.
Neil, your taxes are going to put me out of a job. You're
This was one of the few occasions that Mr Kinnock has tried to get his message across face to face. Most people, though, saw no more than the top of his head. The coming week is likely to feature more of the tightly controlled campaigning that's characterised the past 3 weeks. Labour managers believe it's a discipline that served them well, and that Mr Major's soapbox tactic has played into their hands by making their man appear more prime ministerial than the Prime Minister. They promise some surprises in the countdown to polling day, but the main thrust of their strategy now will be to stay positive and keep out of trouble.
For a party that likes to think of itself as thrusting into the next century, the warm-up act at Llandudno this afternoon had a distinctly old-fashioned feel to it. It was, though, only a brief flirtation with the past, and when Mr Ashdown arrived to customary scenes of enthusiasm, he was soon talking about a new electoral system and how the Tories, particularly, were standing in the way of electoral progress.
The fact of the matter is that the Tories would rather have a Labour government in this country than to give you fair votes and justice in the ballot box. That's the kind of election we now have.
He doesn't want to get stuck on it, but Paddy Ashdown believes the issue of proportional representation has been a huge plus for his campaign this week. Both the other parties have felt the need to address it, and by doing so, they've talked up the Liberal Democrats' chances. As the campaign bus made its way through North Wales today, the press were talking and writing about a party which had succeeded in becoming electoral news. The Liberal Democrats' fear that the media might concentrate only on their third place in the polls has been banished by the last few days. The elderly engines of the campaign plane still have some way to go, but with the bulk of his presidential-style tour behind him, Paddy Ashdown can at least point to the fact that he and his party are in the public eye as polling day draws close.
In the event of a hung parliament, Northern Ireland could have a decisive influence on the policies of the next government. The Unionist parties had a dozen seats between them in the last parliament, and they say they'll act together in the new one. But the main nationalist party, the SDLP, takes the Labour whip.
This is about as flamboyant as electioneering gets in Northern Ireland. The leaders of the two main Unionist parties using a kitchen sink to say the opposition are going down the plug hole. But Jim Molyneux and Ian Paisley's parties are opposing each other in some safe constituencies for the first time since 1983. But where a nationalist or a Republican has won or could win, they campaign for a single agreed Unionist candidate. For them, disposing of the Anglo-Irish agreement is paramount.
Now, there is a great wrong being done to Northern Ireland, and we want to put that wrong right. And that is why we're having talks, and the purpose of the talks is to find an alternative to and a replacement of the Anglo-Irish agreement.
If there's a hung parliament, these two parties will be a substantial united voting bloc, which could be crucial. Historically, Unionists had close ties with the Conservatives, but they also helped keep a Labour government in power in the 1970s. John Hume, the leader of the biggest nationalist party, the SDLP, could have a key role too. He was one of their 3 MPs last time, and they take the Labour whip, seats which could make all the difference to Neil Kinnock. John Hume will sit down in a studio with Gerry Adams, but like every other party in Ireland, not in the negotiating chamber.
The effects of violence are that over 3,000 human beings are in their graves. There are armed troops on our streets who wouldn't be there if there was no violence. And of course, it's preventing the inward investment that we need to tackle the unemployment problems of our young people.
The SDLP and Sinn Féin compete for votes in the Catholic community, with Gerry Adams' party this time trying not to be the IRA's political wing. They want their own identity and insist they must be involved in talks if there's to be a lasting peace.
Well, for 25 years, the British government have the major responsibility. There is a way to resolve it. There is a way to move forward. We want peace. There's a way to bring about peace. The British government have to play their part in creating the conditions for peace.
John Alderdice and the Alliance party he leads feel they're the only ones who represent in strength both Protestants and Catholics. For that reason, they believe that in the talks on the province's political future, they're the indispensable oil between the unionist and nationalist gears. Peter Brooke, the Northern Ireland Secretary, set up those talks, and he's been actively campaigning there. For the first time ever, Conservative candidates are running in the province at a general election. Everyone agrees the overwhelming issue is peace. Thousands of school children who've known nothing but the Troubles took to the streets this week, demanding that the violence stop. Yet there's no end in sight. There still isn't a universally agreed definition of the political terms on which that final peace might be negotiated.
Later in this news, trying to stop the township violence in South Africa. Nelson Mandela calls for an international peacekeeping force. And how 500,000 children cast their votes in their own general election. Now, the time is 6:17.
Tonight's headlines: Jason Donovan has been awarded £200,000 in libel damages. An article in the Face magazine had suggested he was a homosexual and a liar and a hypocrite for denying it. Neil Kinnock has denied making overtures to the Liberal Democrats on proportional representation. John Major has accused Labour of cuddling up to the Liberal Democrats for support. And Paddy Ashdown has warned both parties not to try to go it alone with a minority government. The president of the African National Congress, Nelson Mandela, has called for the setting up of an international peacekeeping force to help combat violence in South Africa's townships. He says he'll be approaching the United Nations and the Organisation of African Unity about the plan. He was speaking during a visit to Alexandra Township, where about 40 people have died in the past month.
For the embattled residents of Alexandra, a gesture of solidarity. Nelson Mandela came here under growing pressure from his grassroots support to do something to end violence. After nearly a month of bitter factional fighting, there is a sense of war weariness on the streets of Alexandra. In the offices of the local council, Nelson Mandela met some of the hundreds who have had to flee their homes. They, more than any, want peace.
They're having sleepless nights because they're sleeping on the floor. They've lost the comfort of their houses. They want to go back to their houses. We are nearing winter. It's cold. Some of them are sleeping outside.
Mr. Mandela's answer to that plea was to call for foreign intervention in all of South Africa's troubled townships.
There is no other solution for this problem other than an international monitoring group. We wanted to put forward this demand as one of the utmost urgency.
But what must also worry Nelson Mandela is the inability of political organisations to control the actions of their own supporters.